Probably one of the most central components of Bootstrap that allows developers to easily create responsive layouts is the grid system. So let's go ahead and take a look how it works. So here's a quick snippet of HTML that's going to help us go through the different components of the grid system. So pretty much any Bootstrap grid layout is going to have these components as part of it. And as I mentioned before, you could see that it does impose a bit of a structure into your HTML code, but most of the time it would probably come up with this type of structure anyway. So let's go ahead and take a look as to what the structure is. First of all, your Bootstrap grid always has to be inside of a container wrapper. There are a couple of choices for that. One, you could use the container class, or you could use the container fluid class. The container fluid class stretches your layout to full width of the browser and provides consistent padding around your grid and other content. There's other content that could go into the container, not just the grid. It's just that the grid requires that it should be inside of a container wrapper. So that's container fluid. Regular container class has predetermined fixed width that is still responsive based on the width of the browser. In other words, it has certain width of one breakpoint, a different width at a different breakpoint, and so on. Remember that breakpoints are those media query range boundaries that we covered in one of the previous lectures. The next component of the grid is the row. So the row class creates horizontal groups of columns, which means that the columns collapse and interact with each other as a group, but independently from columns in another row. The row class also creates a negative margin to counteract the padding that the container class sets up. Now, why is that done? Well, each column already has its own padding because we want to visually separate columns from each other. If negative margin wasn't applied to the row, the padding of the container would then be in addition to the padding of the edge column. So the content of the column will no longer align nicely with the rest of the content outside of the grid. Now, the Bootstrap documentation actually talks about this and explains it. But to be honest, I myself stared at it for a while before I finally understood what it's trying to say. So let me put together a quick diagram so you'll visually see what we're talking about. Okay, so obviously I'm going to start with the browser, and then I'm going to visually build up what our grid layout is going to look like. So the first thing the documentation says is we need to have an element whose class is equal container. Well, that's our element right there. It's in white. That's our container class. Then we're going to have another element inside of that is a row, at least has a class row. Except this time, just for demonstration purposes, we're not going to give it a row, we're going to give it a row no negative margin, meaning it's going to be the same row, but we're not going to give it the negative margin just for these illustration purposes. And you can see outside of our grid, but yet still within the container, we have some regular content that is basically right against the edge of the container. And then we're going to place our columns. Each column, as you can see, has some padding around it so it could separate itself from the other columns. So far so good, right? Well, not exactly. Because if you look as to where the line of the column content starts and where the line of the regular content starts, you'll see that they don't match. Now, having consistently aligned edges of different content structures within your page is actually a pretty basic design principle, and Bootstrap implements that basic design principle for you so you don't trip up. So let's go ahead and visually now fix this problem. So what we're going to do is we're going to again start with a browser and a container element with some regular content, and then we're going to add our real Bootstrap class row element. And what it does is, again, it stretches itself beyond the container. It negates the container's padding of actually 15 pixels to be exact, and it adds a negative 15 pixel margin. So what that does for our content in the columns is that it pushes it outwards. So what does that do? Well, what it does is now that our column content aligns perfectly with the regular content that is outside of our grid, but is still inside the container wrapper. Now, the concept of aligning the different edges of content blocks to each other is nothing new, and any good website actually does that. In fact, if you ever look at a website and something just doesn't feel quite right, take a look at the aligning. I bet you the aligning of different blocks of different content elements within the page aren't aligned nicely, and your eye kind of naturally tells you that something's wrong. Let's take a quick look at the webpage, facebook.com/Coursera webdev, which, by the way, I'm once again encouraging you to go ahead and like and sign up for the notifications when I publish some optional free content. But let's take a look at this page, and I just took one little piece of that page. And if you take a look, this concept of aligning different blocks of content is alive and well here. As you can see, the picture, the text, and even the buttons below very well aligned together, and it's very pleasing to the eye, and it's easy to read. At the same time, Coursera Web Dev and published by Yaakov Chaikin, right, it's also very much aligned as well, and it gives it such structure such that it's pleasing to the eye, and there's certainly plenty of studies about the fact that this is the way that the human eye actually follows a web page. Okay, so that's what the row class does. Let's move on to the columns. You've seen this type of column class definition in our lecture on responsive design before. So in terms of how Bootstrap defines it, let's go ahead and take it apart. So every Bootstrap column class is defined using this template. It's col for column, dash size, and then dash span. And let's go over the components of this, or the two components of this template. First of all, the size. Well, the size is a screen width range identifier, and it's like something like MD for medium, LG for large, and so on. And you could look up what that means in the Bootstrap documentation. So, for example, LG is defined as 1200 pixels and above, so minimum of 1200 pixels. And what that means is that columns will collapse. In other words, they'll stack one upon each other below that width. So if the screen width is 1200 pixels and above for, let's say, a large size, it will go ahead and honor whatever you specified in this column dash size dash span. But if the screen width is below 1200 pixels, this class will no longer apply. And basically what that will mean is that the columns in your row will collapse on each other, meaning they will stack one on top of the other. Which basically means that if you had several columns before, now you'll just have one column because everything is going to just stack one upon the other. And that is all unless there's another rule that applies. This is assuming there's no other rules that apply. So for example, if for LG large you specified one column span, and then for a medium size you specified another column span, well, when you squeeze the browser, make the browser less wide, and you cross that threshold of 1200 pixels, the large column span will no longer apply. But if you've specified an MD or medium size of the screen, that then will kick in and that will apply. And the span is really all it is how many columns the element should span. So the values are from 1 to 12. And I've mentioned many times that Bootstrap is a 12-column grid layout. And what that means is the second the columns will add up to 12, so if you specify, let's say, 4, 4, and 4, that will add up to 12. If you start specifying more than 12 columns within the row, well, they'll do what other floats do, is that they will wrap to the next row. But it won't be a row within Bootstrap, it will just basically wrap itself automatically. So the point is, if you're specifying a whole bunch of columns, the element that pushes the total sum of the spans above 12 will automatically wrap to the next line. And this process can keep going every 12 columns. Lastly, there's nothing really magical about using divs as we did before in the example on the slide. You're free to use whatever makes sense to you in your design. In this example, we're using the header and nav elements to define container and row components. In part 2 of this lecture, we're going to jump into the editor and try some of these concepts out.